We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
There are many sources of energy available.
Everything is energy. My God, do we need this war? Free our mind.
Corporations have taken over the world.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
Hello, you're very welcome once again to the Irish Side of the Moon. This is Michael at the microphone saying hello and welcome. Last week we spoke with Rico Paganini, and you can find that interview as well as many others leading up to show 85 on our blog, irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com, as well as iTunes. And don't forget, we're on Facebook as well. I'll give you the information at the end of the show. This week's show, number 86, and the guest is Greg Corbin, author of Beyond Reason, Lessons from the Loss of a Gifted Child. Sometimes people enter our lives and change us forever. Author Greg Corbin's son Brian was such a person. In Beyond Reason, Greg shares the story of his 9-year-old son, a sweet and brilliant child. Though healthy, Brian told his parents he was going to die before he reached the age of 10. 6 months later, after scoring the first run of his Little League career, he collapsed. This thought-provoking and beautifully written memoir presents powerful images, ideas and emotions. The story's unfolding is impossible to anticipate. It demands pages be turned all the way to the end. And I'm on the line right now with Greg Corbin, MD, the author of Beyond Reason, Lessons from the Loss of a Gifted Child. Greg, it's a pleasure to speak to you. How are you today?
Oh, I'm very good. Thanks for having me on your show.
You're very welcome. I'm very much looking forward to talking to you. I always say that because we're very privileged with the people we get, but this really is coming from the heart. Before we talk about the book, and we will be talking mostly about the book and everything we cover in it, we always like to talk a little bit about the person. We always like to find out about the person behind the message, and it's always relevant because on our show it's always good to know who our guests were before they kind of started the work they're doing. But in your case it's especially interesting, I think, because one of the threads that runs through the book is your own journey, and I think it'll make a lot more sense to our listeners if we kind of go back a little bit first. Let's go back a few years. I know you had served as an artillery officer in the Vietnam era. What other things would you tell us about the young version of Greg Corbin? I mean, you're a writer now. You're appearing on countless radio shows. Were you always an artistic person? Were you always writing? Were you always a real people person? Because I've heard you on many shows, and telling stories and speaking comes easily to you. It seems to. Was that always the case?
Well, the backstory of the book is that people have told me the book is well written, and it's won several awards. And the young Greg Corbin, until Brian died, the story of that I write about. Before that happened, nobody was a worse writer than I was, and nobody liked writing less than I did because it involved emotions and anything creative. I could write a technical paper, and I was always a technical person. I never liked fiction, anything like that. And so I was successful in academics, all in my head, and had a lot of trouble relating to people emotionally. I was very uncomfortable at funerals, talking about death, things like that. And I compensated by working long hours in a very intellectual manner.
And you work in the medical profession. Tell us a little bit about that as well. What drew you to that area of life? How did you become drawn to that?
Okay. Well, after high school, I went into the Army, served 3 years, enlisted as a Special Forces medic, and then went to officer candidate school and became an artillery officer. And then I came out, went to Duke, graduated, and then went on to Duke Medical School, and then did a residency in anesthesia and a fellowship in pain management. And it's really interesting when I look at what I was trying to do with my life, even though it wasn't conscious. I wanted, when I got into pain management, I really wanted to get into the human side of medicine, because pain is basically the universal thing that brings somebody to a doctor. And about half of it is not physical. Half of it's emotional, spiritual, expressed in a physical complaint. And I didn't know any of this stuff at the time. I just knew I was drawn to that. And actually, when I was writing the book and about my own great loss and my own great pain, I realized that pain and emptiness are kind of threads that drive all of our daily lives. But we don't really realize it until it gets huge, like when you lose a beautiful, gifted child. And so that experience drew my attention to what I had been doing all of my life. So.
And again, in the book, at a later stage, you use the phrase unconscious flight to describe much of your life, probably all of your life before, as you say, Brian came into it, in terms of everything you were doing and just kind of getting involved in. I know you were kind of a bit of a daredevil at different stages of your life too. You're interested in extreme sports, I suppose is one way to describe it. And again, that too is a way to kind of, I suppose, shield yourself, distance yourself.
Oh, absolutely. What I realized after I had been grieving this wonderful 9-year-old child who gifted, it was such a gift, and then left such a huge emptiness. And what I realized as I was trying to see, the grieving process that I had been reading about, that's the way I cope with things. I study them and intellectualize and take them apart. And what I read, the stages of grief, Kubler-Ross and all that sort of stuff, it really didn't describe what was happening to me or to the people I could see around me that were grieving different things. And then I also realized, when I looked back on my life, that I had this huge emptiness that was just in the middle of my chest, that it had always been there. And I had always been grieving. I just never had a reason. And now that Brian died, I had the best reason in the world. Now people would come and support me, but the actual emptiness that I felt was the same. And it's just because I had been afraid of that emptiness and running away from it. I had done all of these, pushed myself to the limit, all these adrenaline sports. And by rights, I should have died at least 4 times.
And probably the last question, I suppose, before we get on to the book. Speaking of death, were you, at that stage in your life, go back to the 70s, early 80s, did you ever think of death? Were you afraid of dying? Was it ever something that was on your mind at all, the idea of the bigger picture?
Yes. Well, I had no belief in a spiritual world.
None. None whatsoever. No, none. Just it wasn't for you. It didn't work for you at that stage. No.
Right. And I was a product of my culture, and I'm not sure what exactly it's like in Ireland, but over here in the U.S., basically you're told that culture tells you, and even religion, that there's no magic, that it's a materialistic world, and you really just have to learn how to deal with it. So that was my belief system.
That was your system. Okay, let's move on. And the most important thing we want to talk about today, I'm holding it in my hand here. Beyond Reason, Lessons from the Loss of a Gifted Child is the book. In your own words and in your own time, tell me about Brian.
Well, Brian was a special kid, and he died at the age of 9. And when he was born, he was our first child, and we were delighted. I always loved being around kids, and I had a hard time playing, and had a hard time relating to adults. And I always wanted a lot of kids, because I can relate to kids, and I can get down on the floor and play and be silly and stuff like that. So he was born, and I had a secret dread all the way through the pregnancy. Now, anesthesiologists, which is what I am, we resuscitate people every day. What most people don't realize is that every anesthetic, every time somebody comes in for surgery, it's the same thing as a lethal injection, except without the potassium. That stops the heart. But a lot of places, it's the same thing, and you just resuscitate them. So that is something I do every day. And my one dread was that I would have to resuscitate Brian when he was born, because a lot of times when we're there at the delivery, we're the one that has to resuscitate the baby. So that was part of the nightmare of his birth. Everything had been normal, and then the day Catherine, my wife, went into labor, we went into the hospital, and our obstetrician was on vacation, and we met for the first time the obstetrician that was taking care, that was filling in. And Catherine, we had everything planned. Catherine was going to get an epidural for the pain, and that was my specialty. I wrote books about epidurals and gave lectures and stuff. But we discovered as the day went on, she never got her epidural, and the obstetrician was, in fact, insane. He was going insane with schizophrenia, and he would come in and say one thing one time and one thing another. And Catherine was screaming in pain, and here, this is my specialty, and I can't. And I didn't have privileges. I could have easily done the epidural myself, but I didn't have the way to do that. And then, so this turned into one huge nightmare. And then it was time for Catherine to push Brian out. And I thought, oh, at least this part of the nightmare is over, and I can relax. But then he was born, and they took Brian over and cleaned him up, put him in a bassinet, and then turned away to help Catherine. And then I was the only one who noticed that he stopped breathing, so I had to resuscitate him. And brought him back, but he never turned pink like he was supposed to, so he was a blue baby. He had a heart defect. And then we discovered other things the matter with him. And so our first couple of years were a real nightmare, truly. He had ear infections and colic, and he needed lots of other procedures. He wasn't breathing right. I had to open up his airway passages. Now, he was a gorgeous baby, and the pictures on my website, you can see, when you see a little, you can see at 3 months before he had his heart surgery, and he's kind of, it's not the picture, he's kind of dark because he was blue, but you can look at in his eyes, and he was like so deep. People, when I was going through training in college, our psychologist told us that children were born as a blank slate, that they had no personalities and they were totally to be molded, which is what is told, taught, and that's our education system is based on that. They're all to be trained, and you can just look at this child and look in his eyes and see that there's a whole lot of depth there.
And that website, of course, it's beyondreason.info. We'll be putting a link on our site, and we'll be referring to it at the end of the interview as well. But yeah, you've got a website there with regard to the book, and there's also a forum growing up and people sharing experiences. We'll talk about that as we go on. You mentioned the doctor who was having the issues on the day of the birth, and I know from the book that person actually lost their practice about a week or two later. So
right.
The horrendous timing. The book.
Well, the metaphor was that Brian was born into an insane world. I mean, which he was.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The book that's actually how you open the book, and it's extraordinary. I honestly felt reading it as if I was intruding. You write it so well, and you do share, and we'll talk about that again I suppose later on, but you share everything that was going on in those early years, and it's almost, I felt guilty. I felt like I was reading your diary, because you tell it so well, and it just becomes so easy to empathize with it and relate to it the way you tell it. And I almost felt like I was doing something wrong by reading it, but that's a compliment for the way you tell it. Those early years, okay, turbulent, and then as Brian got a little bit older, things kind of came around. Okay,
well, we were scared to death because we knew he was going to have heart surgery and all that stuff, and that went well at the age of 5 months. And then he had lots of procedures, and then after he was about 1.5, 2 years, things started settling down, and then we were over the hump. I mean, all of his minor things were corrected. We were told he would have a normal life, and he started showing signs of being really gifted. Now, Brian turns out he was a lot smarter than I was, and he also was much more spiritually enlightened. He knew all kinds of stuff that I didn't even know existed. And gee, I wish that knowing what I knew now, to go back and talk to him and ask him how he knew these things and how the world works and stuff like that, because he was way beyond what I was. But then again, I think that I did the best I could at the time.
Of course. He talked about, at one stage, one of the things that leaped out at me was he talked about the 4 places you go when you die.
Uh-huh. Well, as he was, okay, let me just capture a little bit more about him before we get to that, because that stuff came out
later
as he was getting ready to die. But he was he was full of life, and he loved entertaining people, and he had a real gift for speaking in front of crowds. He had a very clear, strong voice that carried to the back rows, and a couple times he would get in front of a crowd, and it would just be magical. I think he was, it's probably about a year before he died, at the age of 8, and we were at a summer camp, and he wanted to join the talent show, so he went up and gave a little karate demonstration of a karate form, and he'd been taking it for 9 months. And he started dancing around on stage, creating this imaginary form, and my wife and I just looked at each other, and it was so beautiful. It was this incredible, I don't know how to describe it, but we were captivated. When he finished, we looked at each other and said, wow. And then this whole auditorium with all of the campers started clapping and cheering in unison and saying his name, Brian, Brian, Brian. It was like he had created this incredibly beautiful, magical moment for us. So he was always coming up with, he was like Tom Sawyer in some ways, always coming up with tall tales and pulling practical jokes on us, and he kind of modeled himself after Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin, and he memorized all the books, and if he wanted us to know a joke, he'd just tell us the book and the page number, and we'd look it up.
He was quite mischievous, as you say, with his tall tales and his pranks.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he just never knew what he was going to come up with. So our life was just never, it was never dull. And then as he was getting ready for his 9th birthday, and he died when he was about 9 and a half, he became uncharacteristically introspective and quiet. And then it was time to start planning his birthday party. And he told us that he didn't want to have a party because it would bring his death closer.
And his health was fine. His health was fine at this stage, as far as you knew.
Right, as far as we knew. He had no complaints. He wasn't followed by cardiology anymore. He was playing soccer, and I mean, there was, absolutely
he was out. He was going to school. He had friends. He was just a normal 7, 8, 9. Yeah, he was a normal kid. Yeah,
as far as we knew. So I mean, none of this made sense to us, and then Brian started getting obsessed by thoughts of death, had trouble sleeping. Now, my wife, Catherine, I was in pain management, which is mostly psychology, so I was always working with psychologists and psychiatrists. I'm very used to dealing with psychological issues, and I couldn't see anything that would be causing this. Catherine is a minister and a pastoral counselor, and we tried very hard to comfort him and reassure him that there was no reason for him to worry about dying, but he just kept getting more and more despondent. And then we eventually became desperate and took him to a psychologist. And the psychologist, Brian really liked going to the psychologist because he would learn psychology from the psychologist. And the psychologist, they really enjoyed their time together. The psychologist said that Brian showed him the ways that his mind worked in ways that he'd never learned before. What was going on behind the scenes, and also talked about some hints of mystical sort of connections and stuff. So So we never discovered any issues to deal with, but Brian really enjoyed, getting to know the field of psychology. And then
it probably, do you think, looking back, it helped him? He was obviously thinking about big issues, and he was quite comfortable with them. So maybe those dialogues, those conversations, probably helped him come to terms in his own mind with the huge issues that he was dealing with very well.
Well, we rallied around him as much as we could. There were, the thing about Brian was that he made this whole thing so public. I mean, we were struggling with his depression and his obsession with death, and the teachers at school knew about it, and the school counselor knew about it, and the people at church knew about it. So there were probably maybe 50 people that knew that we were struggling with Brian's foretelling of his death before he died. And
how long did this go on for?
Oh, okay. This went for probably 5-6 months. Okay, and his birthday was in January, so it was right in the middle of winter that this kind of came out. And then, but Brian, as he was getting very much focused on his death, which we didn't really understand, that he really knew that he was going to, in fact, die. Then they would talk. Catherine would spend hours at bed with him, trying to get him to relax and be able to go to sleep. And they would talk about death. And we saw the movie Ghost. And after that, they talked about, what happens after death. And Brian told her about the 4 places you can go, but she only remembered 2 of them. But
it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's just extraordinary.
Right. Mm-hmm. But we wish that we could have, learned more from him while he was still with us, in a physical form. So about a month before he died, in the spring, as the days got longer and all the buds came out, he started coming out of his depression, and said, kind of became his old self again. And he, about 3 weeks before he died, said it was time for his party. But it was going to be, instead of a belated birthday party, it was going to be a happy spring party. And he didn't want any presents, just his 3 best friends. And so we planned the party, and then all of these other things were kind of converging that I didn't realize were possible. But he was finishing up all of his loose ends, and unfinished business. He insisted that I get Catherine's. He died the day before Mother's Day, and he insisted that I get her Mother's Day present in advance. He wrote a poem for her, and he even insisted that Catherine get my Father's Day present, even though it was months away. And a little Oscar statue says, "World's Greatest Dad," made out of plastic, which, of course, is one of the great treasures of my life. He wrote his grandparents, and he settled his score, with the bullies at school, stuff like that. And we didn't quite realize it until we looked back and saw that he was doing that. He also had, parents from Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin was always tormenting his parents with one thing and another, and one thing that if his parents did something that Calvin didn't like, Calvin would come up with a parents' poll showing they're going down. So he started getting into that, and we'd tell him to clean up his room, and he'd post a parents' poll, and our approval scores went down, stuff like that. And let's see, there were other things converging, but that gives you the gist of it. So then 2 days before he died, Catherine was driving home, and she saw Brian on the driveway. We live out in the country, pulling his little red wagon with his teddy bears on it and his camping gear. And she said, "Brian, where are you going?" And he said, "Well, it's time for me to go on my trip." He'd been talking about going on a trip the last few days, and then he would change it. One day it would be Montana, another day Wisconsin. So she stopped the car and got out and sat down next to him on the side of the road and said, "Well, you have your party in 2 days. You can't go now." And she said, besides, if you go on your trip, I'll miss you terribly. And he said, well, I know that, but this is something I have to do. I have to go. I can't be a wimp. And so she put him on her lap, and, they talked for a while. And she said, well, since you have your party, just stay here for a couple more days, and until you have your party, and we'll pitch the tent, and you can camp out the night before the party. That'll be your trip for now. And he tried doing that in the past, but he'd always been afraid of the dark. So he thought that was a great idea. So it was a new challenge for him. So he turned around, pulled his wagon back to the house, and then the next day was beautiful. We got the house ready for the party, and we pitched the tent for him, and then he and Sasha, our dog, and his teddy bear spent the night in the tent. Now, a lot of things, it took me about 10, 12 years to really understand all of the things that were going on. And even then, I still discovered new things. But there were so many little threads that were twining together and forming the tapestry of what was going on. And I didn't realize till years later that Sasha, who spent the night with him, was the most courageous being I had ever met. I mean, she was this little Eskimo dog, sort of like a husky.
Husky type, yeah.
Yeah, and she was like fearless, and she was like very intuitive. But she spent the night with him. And I could tell you stories about her that were really very, very unique too. I've been blessed with very gifted children and very gifted dogs. And she was very, very unique. And one thing I think she did was that she gave Brian her courage for that night before he died. So he spent the night in the tent and came in the next morning. He was so proud of himself for overcoming his fear of the dark. And when the kids showed up for the party, it was the most beautiful spring day you ever saw. It was crisp and clear, blue sky, and the air was full of honeysuckle, which is very unusual for that time of year. The kids came, and they had their party, and instead of presents, his girlfriend gave him a kiss, and his best friend wrote a song for him, Friends Forever, Always Together. And then the parents came, and then we had an hour before it was time for me to take him to his baseball game. And he went to his room and started writing things, and we didn't realize what he was doing till afterwards. One thing he did was he put a parents' poll, and he posted it where we would see it after he died. Very first thing we saw when we walked in was the parents' poll. And for the first time today, he had given us a perfect 2,000, perfect score. He put a sign up on his door that we didn't see until later. Brian's on a trip, don't worry about me. He often had signs up, but they were humorous. Brian's room, keep out, this means you, stuff like that. He started doing that when it was for the month before, when he was starting to get ready, and he said it was time for his party. He wrote a couple of letters to some girls in the class. He was a real flirt. He was quite a ladies' man, and he liked girls. And so even though he just had his girlfriend over for his party, he was writing a couple letters to some other girls in his class too. And then it was time for us to go to this baseball game. Now, this was his second baseball game, and I had encouraged him to do Little League baseball because I thought it would be nice. He was such an intellectual little kid that it would be good for him to do a team sport. And it was really difficult for him. He was afraid of the hard ball. He was the littlest kid on the team, and it didn't come easily for him, but he kept trying. And the first game, the week before that he'd ever played, he got stranded on third base. So he got in the car and we were driving to the game. And he told me that he wanted to score a run today more than anything. That was his goal. And we stopped off the mailbox and he wanted to mail his letters. But they didn't have stamps on them. Now, he was a really smart kid. And I said, Brian, those won't get mailed without stamps on them. And he said, well, you don't understand, they will get there. And he was so determined, I didn't argue with him, so we left him there. Went to the baseball game. And it was like we got there and he leaped out of the car. It was like this totally different kid. He'd lost all of his fear of the baseball. And he was charging after during the practice, and he was charging after the ground balls and leaping in the air to catch fly balls. He was like this totally different kid. He was just so joyful playing baseball. And then it was his first up at bat, and he was so little he got walked to first base. The next kid hit a triple, and he rounded the bases, and the coach on third base, waved him home, and we were all cheering. He crossed home plate, and he was the happiest little boy you ever saw. His eyes were glowing, and he was getting high fives from everybody. He looked at me and gave me a thumbs up, and then he trotted over into the dugout, and then he sat down, and then he just collapsed. His heart had an arrhythmia, and it just stopped beating. And so that was the end of his life, but that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the first chapter. And all of these other things kept happening, and it became more and more powerful that Brian's influence was continuing. And that's basically, the first part of the book. And then the other stuff that started happening was stuff way out of my belief system.
Because, you said that, at the start, like, the stuff that was about to happen was just beyond anything you believed in or thought was possible. Brian's untimely passing, ended up opening up a completely new chapter in your own life.
Oh, it was. It wasn't even a chapter. It's an entirely new life.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Which is why, I want to share the story because people seem to be so hungry for that now, with spiritual truth, spiritual reality, that there's so much more than what we've been taught, and that Brian really came to show us that.
And how did his story is so remarkable. At the time, did the mainstream media, and we're going back to the early 90s, did they respond to the idea of a little boy who knew his own death was coming? What happened in the mainstream?
Well, that was, okay, so he died, and I tried to resuscitate him again, but somehow I knew he wasn't coming back this time. And then all these paranormal things started happening that day. And I was, of course, in shock. The very worst thing that could have ever happened just happened. And couldn't eat and all that stuff like that. But the story made the wire services. And so it was on national news, radio, newspapers, and even TV. Boyd, I was playing Little League, and we got these phone calls from these reporters. Now, even in the midst of my shock, I was going, how did this happen? How could this child know that in advance he was going to die? He gave himself a going away party and left goodbye gifts and notes and all of these things. And he did it so publicly. Maybe 100 people saw the sign that he wrote. Brian's on a trip, don't worry about me, in his parents' bowls when they came to comfort us after he died. I thought, this is the most wonderful thing that Brian is showing us. And surely people must want to know about this, that something like this is possible. And so when the reporters called, I would say, and Brian told us he was going to die. He told us, months before, and the day he died, he gave himself a party and left notes and stuff like that, and going away gifts. And nobody ever followed up on it. I thought, there's so many things that are verifiable here. Anybody who ever was interested in paranormal stuff or that, this is the time they could talk to 50 people that talked about how he said he was going to die and things like that.
But nobody would touch it.
But nobody, absolutely nobody, would tell the story.
That's going back to, as you said, the society tells us there's no magic, there's no spirituality. They just don't want to acknowledge it.
It's absolutely right. It's absolutely kept out of the mainstream media, and out of school and out of religion. Now, 100 years ago, people used to, this stuff was much more accepted, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Why that was. It wasn't filtered out of the media so much, and there wasn't so much control by the media. and people would actually sit down and talk about their own real experiences. And when you do that, you see these things are common. They're not paranormal. They are normal. And about half the parents of children that died accidentally, as I mentioned in the book, talk about how the child, either drew a picture or did something to indicate that they knew they were going to die, and try and...
This was soon after. I mean, after you started going to a group, a support group, Compassionate Friends, and that's where you discovered that. As you got talking to people face to face, one on one, you found out exactly what you just said.
Oh yeah, I mean, people know they can talk to me about these things, and so I hear these things all the time. I was out at lunch with my minister. And she said, well, when you write this book and you give interviews, you're opening yourself up to ridicule because, these things are not supposed to happen. And while we were talking, I said, well, this is my son's story, and I'm telling it. And if it opens me to ridicule, so be it. I mean, this is reality, and it really doesn't matter to me. What matters is that my son's life and continuing story make a difference to other people like it did for me. And then while we were there, two elderly women came by and said hello. And the minister said, one of them, a month ago, they were best friends, lived next to each other, two couples. And this woman's husband died. And as he died, unbeknownst to the other man next door, the best friend, who was working in the garden, he heard this man's voice saying, tell Patricia not to worry about me. I'm okay. Loud and clear, this man's voice in the garden with no person there. And this man who heard this voice had no idea that his best friend neighbor had just died at that exact time, and found out about it later. And so, I mean, these stories are everywhere. And 100 years ago, people had license to talk about them and share them. And so this stuff was much more in mainstream culture. But now it's all been filtered out.
We're going to just take a quick break at that stage. You're listening to The Irish Side of the Moon, talking to Greg Corbin, and we'll be right back after this short break.
You're listening to The Irish Side of the Moon. You can hear our new episodes every Monday on radiomedia.org and irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com. You can also download episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, and many other sites. You can follow us on Twitter, you can join our Facebook group, and if you're already in the group, don't forget to invite your friends. If you have any ideas for future guests on the show, send an email to shane@theirishsideofthemoon.ie. We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment.
And you're back with The Irish Side of the Moon, talking with Greg Corbin, MD, author of Beyond Reason, Lessons from the Loss of a Gifted Child. BeyondReason.info is the website. We've been talking, Greg, about your own past. We got a picture of your youth. As you say, you were non-spiritual, a man in unconscious flight. We've got kind of a painting of kind of what interested you, the career path you took, etc. Things began to change in the 80s. A wonderful baby boy, your first child. You've had two since, is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. Your first, Brian, came into your life in the 80s. Remarkable individual, wonderful personality, and was with you for almost a decade. Coming into the early 90s, he passed away. Circumstances of his the lead up to his passing, extraordinary, and as you say, it's completely opened up a whole new life for you. Before we took a break, you were saying you were in conversation with your minister, fear that telling Brian's story would open you up to ridicule. Has that happened? Has anybody said to you, oh, this couldn't be, or you're dreaming, or it couldn't be right, or I mean, has that happened? Are those fears from your friend grounded, or has that just not been the case when you actually tell people this story?
On a personal level, it has not happened. What I discovered early was a lot of people, if I started trying to tell the story, a lot of people didn't want to hear it. So I only tell the story now if somebody expresses an interest. So that's part of it. About half people I discovered, even if I thought they might be interested, they would open the conversation that they believe in life after death or something like that, and they were struggling with their own grief. Then I thought, well, this would be helpful. And then about half of them would change the subject and obviously didn't want to hear. So I haven't been confronted with that too much yet. But what I did notice was the first big coverage that the story got was on National Public Radio on StoryCorps. And that was, I talk about how StoryCorps actually helped us get the story out there. And that was the first kind of honest media that would actually let us tell the story without changing it. One thing I discovered, we were talking about how the media wouldn't tell the story, or what they did do was it made it on one national radio show that I had great respect for previously for this fellow, and he always seemed to have a spiritual side to his story. So I thought this would be a good, that he would do a good job. Well, he changed the story, and he said, knowing that Brian was dying of terminal heart disease, his one wish was to score a run, and he got up off his deathbed and staggered around the bases and collapsed across home plate and died. And I thought, and this was a few days after Brian died. I was still in shock, and I thought, why would they lie? The real story is so much more wonderful. Why would they defile the story and twist it, to suit their own purposes? And so that was my first, fear of the media, was that they would twist the story.
The mainstream tend to make everything Hollywood, to make it sexy, and if the truth gets in the way, it's disregarded.
Well, they want to make it sexy, but they want to keep it from being too powerful.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah. So it becomes a cliche then, because the story that you described there is more cliched, whereas the real story is remarkable because it's unique.
It's much more freeing. It frees you of your limitations, which is what Brian was trying to do. But so anyhow, talking about that, so on NPR, this story was a stretch for them because it involved some paranormal, what we define as paranormal occurrence, and they were very worried that if they told us on the national radio that they would be criticized for it and ridiculed. So they fact-checked, and they said no. How many people saw the sign? And we said, well, or knew about the sign. We said hundreds. So they went ahead and they did the story, but they said, just to warn you that there will be people on the blog that will start to ridicule it and say it can't happen. And so, indeed, the very first day after it, we had, they had some of the best posts they'd ever had. The story touched people very much, and the response was very positive. And they leave the blog up for 5 days. And what happened was these religious fundamental people took it over, and all the posts on the last day were all, this couldn't have happened, or it was this is not the way it's supposed to work, and it was very negative. So yes, that stuff was out there, but it hasn't really affected me very much.
Brian's influence and the lessons. Brian stayed with you in many respects after his passing, partly because you were trying to come to terms with the way he had lived his final 6 months, but in other ways as well.
Well, it was, I can't imagine any better way, and the word better is strange here. I can't imagine any better way that I could have left my old belief system and moved into a much larger one, and a much more open-ended one, that I could have really basically found my connection with the universe and learned how to accept it and its wisdom. I can't imagine a better way, because I was so tied up with this child. I mean, I resuscitated him when he was born. I resuscitated him when he died. As a physician, I had to be involved with him so much in his early years to keep him alive. And then he was my best friend. So when he left, this huge void was there. And I don't know if you have children, but I always thought that I was a very loving parent and that I loved my child about as much as anybody could. But one thing I discovered was that all these conditions, conditional love, they don't clean up their room, they don't brush their teeth, all these things like that, they really tie up your mind. And when the child dies, and all these conditions go away, what you're left with was the fact that the love was so much stronger and deeper than you had ever thought. It was beyond reason, beyond your thoughts. And it goes to the very fabric of your reality, and even deeper than that, it goes into the roots of our connection with everything. The love is the pathway, and the emptiness is the pathway. And then in that emptiness, all of these incredible things happen. Now, after Brian died, I went back to the ball field, and I reached up. I went to get my car, and
this is immediately after he had passed away. Yeah.
And so I reached up to it was the most beautiful day, and it was the happiest sight. Another game was going on, and square dances and picnics and the smell of barbecue and honeysuckle. You never saw a more joyous, beautiful scene. And part of Virginia, where we live in, is gorgeous, and especially in the spring and the fall. And I reached up to wipe a tear from my eye, and the sour smell of Brian's vomit from my hand from the resuscitation blended with the sweet smell of the honeysuckle. And I went into this altered state that I'd never experienced before. And everything, all the colors got more vivid and brighter, and the sounds and the smells, and I was at peace. And I knew that even though the worst thing that had happened had just happened, everything had happened the way it was supposed to, and that Brian had finished his work, and he'd conquered his fears, which is more than most of us do, and that the rest of the work was mine to do. And so I went back home, and we saw Brian's parents' bowl and his going away sign, and people came to comfort us. And then my daughter, who's 2 years younger than Brian, is mentally handicapped. We had a really rough, she's cerebral palsy and things like that. And so, I mean, those first years were really were a nightmare. We barely survived. So she really was telling us that she couldn't understand that Brian wouldn't be coming home anymore, that she didn't know what death meant. So that night when I went to tuck her in to bed, I got in bed with her and I tried to explain these things. But you have to understand, this was a real stretch for me because I was not used to talking about heaven. I didn't really believe in it. I was an agnostic. But, my heart was open and I was, trying. And I told her, I said, Linny, Brian's up in heaven and he won't be coming home anymore. He's up there now. And she said, yeah, he take airplane? And I said, no, when you die, your body leaves, you leave your body like a butterfly leaves its cocoon, and then you can fly without an airplane. And so, by the way, in that 3 weeks before he died, both kids were obsessed with butterflies, and they were drawing butterflies everywhere and reading stories about butterflies and all that stuff. So there was another thread that I didn't continue. And then so Linny said, Brian not coming home, I said, it's dark. And she looked up at the ceiling, and all of a sudden she got this most beautiful smile on her face. And she was obviously focusing on something. She could really see something that I couldn't see. And then the bed began to vibrate. And then I could see that we were being carried along by this luminous river of energy waves that somehow I knew had always been there. I just never could see it before. And that Brian was still part of it. And then I knew my life was changing at that point. that the meaning of this river and where it was going to carry me was someplace that it was beyond my understanding. And then after that, all of these synchronicities started showing up.
Yes, all the things that happened. Okay, next question. All these things were happening. At some stage, how did it come to the stage where you were writing it down? The start of the book. I know the book was a long time coming, but how did you come to the idea of writing it down? Was it just to cope, to understand?
Yeah. I'd never kept a diary, I was never, because usually you write about your feelings, and I couldn't write about feelings. If I had to write in high school, if I had to write a poem or anything creative, I couldn't do it. I mean, I just blocked. I'd ask my parents to help me. But there was so much going on I couldn't understand. And more things kept going on that I couldn't understand, so I just kept writing things down so I wouldn't forget. And then I was hoping that writing would help me put things together, which it did, of course, but it took 15 years.
Yes.
So I kept getting pieces of the puzzle that kept showing up, that kept completing the story. I'd write the book, and then I thought I'd been done, and that happened about 5 times. And then some huge spiritual breakthrough would happen, and something would appear in my life, and that would lead it to the next stage. And it was only when my mother died at the end that the book finally finished itself up. I needed her help too, as a matter of fact, and I needed to grieve her loss and accept her gifts too.
And that's something about the book, and there's really no need for us to go into it very much, but it's hugely important because Brian is the main core of maybe the first third, and then all the lessons that he taught and continues to teach you occupies the rest of it. And what happens is, and it's one of the reasons it really is a remarkable book, your observations on the passing of others, and you mentioned your mother. There's another death covered as well, the family dog, and you really ponder some remarkable big issues simply by observing how people behave and contrasting it with Brian. And that actually takes up then the rest of the story, and it is lessons, and the subtitle is very apt, because the lessons from Brian then filter everything that has come since.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really amazing how these things work. But after Brian died, my belief system was shattered. I had this huge emptiness. But instead of running away from it now, I realized that that's where Brian was. And I had this huge love that became more and more unconditional. And I just would stay there in it. What am I to learn? How am I supposed to, to use this? And things would appear out of that emptiness. These amazing synchronicities. Well, it turns out I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I came here to teach at the University of Virginia at the medical school, and I had no idea that all of these other things were here. But if you're into consciousness, in the Western world, this is the place. The very first books on out-of-body experiences were here, Robert Monroe, and the Monroe Institute that I was led to. And the very first books about life after death and near-death experiences, Raymond Moody and George Ritchie, that was here in Charlottesville. The very first books documenting, in the Western world, documenting reincarnation were here. In the United States, at least, the longest ongoing commune is right here. There's an ashram here. The fellow who wrote the book, Magical Child, Joseph Chilton Pierce, who became my mentor, he lives here. And I just happened to, to be led right to him, too. So in this emptiness, all of these wonderful teachers, the best teachers in the entire planet, were right here in my own backyard. And they taught me so much, but in the physical world. But Brian, in the non-physical world, in the dream world, would appear. He appeared in dreams, and then one of the lessons was that I had to let go of my love for him as a 9-year-old boy, for him to teach me more. In other words, I had to allow him to become more than just Brian, which he was. And then more and more things happened. So I was very gifted before he died to have Brian, and after he died, for all of the ways that Brian, helped orchestrate the way I learned all of these lessons. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was here too, who wrote, the book Death and Dying, and everybody knows the stages of grief. Now, one thing I learned was the stages of grief really don't happen. What she wrote was very limited. Now, you have to, give her credit. She was a giant, and she made huge contributions. But she was a psychiatrist, and she only saw the people that were referred to her, which were the extreme cases that couldn't deal with grief. And so what I learned in my own grieving process with all of these wonderful teachers that kept showing up was that the grieving process was really, we do it every day. Every action we take, when you're interviewing me because you're missing something, there's something missing, you need stories, and I need an audience, and I need you to give me questions because there are things that I probably haven't quite thought about that you will help me with. And so every action, you learn this in the theater too, every action that occurs on the stage is because the character is missing something at that moment. And the motivation in which Stanislavski came up with this very simple method for knowing how to bring your character to life is, what does your character want at that moment, and what is the clearest action to show it. Now, when you have, so all motion, all action spins around emptiness. It's all like a black hole. And when you assume the different roles of dealing with this emptiness, it's the Wizard of Oz. Those are the basic characters. Same thing as a football game or anything. You've got the different roles, basic 4 different roles. You got the external conflict, the witch; the internal conflict, Cowardly Lion; the intellectual, the brains with no heart, and the heart with no brains. And when they become dysfunctional, you get the stages of grief, except she left out the Scarecrow, which is someone who's very emotional and goes to extremes. That's panic and anxiety, which are as common as the other extreme behaviors. But she didn't, and the reason that she didn't describe that is that if you have somebody, like you have a woman who has a stillborn baby, and you will see the extreme behaviors. She could be in denial and be carried this dead baby around, which of course upsets everybody and all the other mothers on the obstetric ward, and they will get rid of her and send her to a psychiatrist. And same thing if she's very depressed and is crying all the time, and that's hard for them to deal with, and it's upsetting everybody, they'll get rid of her. Or if she is very angry and throwing things around and yelling and screaming, they'll get rid of her. Or if she's denying it and being intellectualizing, or but if she is anxious and just ringing, pacing, that they can treat. They can treat with on the floor with tranquilizers. And so that extreme behavior did not make it to her as much, and that's why she didn't describe it. But we usually don't go to extremes. We usually take a role as a major, and for me it was always the Tin Man, the intellectual, and a minor, and for me that was anger. We usually just, whatever challenge comes up, we take our favorite role to deal with it. And then we also, at some point, need to find our opposite. So for me, as a Tin Man, I had to marry somebody who was very spiritual and very good at relating to people emotionally. So I married a Scarecrow, which is generally the way it goes. You look for your missing parts. So what I discovered is that everything we do day to day in our lives is exactly the same thing you do when you grieve, except when you grieve it becomes so big that you really have to pay attention to it. And the stages of grief aren't really stages. They're roles. They're roles of challenge. and usually we're staying in them, and then at some point we have to find the opposite of whatever our favorite roles are. And if like if you're at a football game, the coach, he's the brains, and the cheerleaders, they're the spirit, and then you've got the football players, they're the the external conflict. Then you have the trainers and the managers that deal with the group's internal conflict. Those are the basic roles. But the coach, when he goes in the locker room, he loses the cheerleaders. So then he sometimes has to take on that role in that environment. But when we have a group, the group will split up. And I've worked with outdoor education, ropes courses, and things like that for many decades. And what I discovered was when you give a group a challenge, it will split up into these exact same roles. And then when the challenge is over, everybody, the roles come back together again and reintegrate. So this is something you see in individuals. We break up into roles or groups. It's the same exact process. It's how we deal with challenge, which is what life is.
I love this stuff. I could listen to you talk all day. And again, that's one of the reasons. There's many reasons, but that's one of the reasons I did enjoy the book so much, because again, this is the train of thought that you are on for the back half of it. Speaking of the book, and I mentioned earlier how incredibly honest it is, and you just mentioned your wife there. I know your late mother was supportive of the book when you were writing it during her lifetime. As it became, I suppose, as publication became a possibility, how did the people in the book, primarily your wife and your family and stuff, react to the idea of such an honest story, such an honest telling of these events being made public? Because it is extraordinarily honest. Everything is really... How did that go down?
It didn't really go well.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now, we did a role reversal, my wife and I. She was the spiritual one, and I was the intellectual one. And after all this stuff started happening to me after Brian died, I would have all these great spiritual breakthroughs, and I'd come home from a retreat, and I'd had these incredible experiences. And I couldn't even talk about them. She'd really get mad at me if I started talking about them, because I was in her turf. This was it, okay? And so we've had a bunch of hard things that are difficult for marriage. The death of a child, a handicapped child, and then it's also very difficult when one of the two goes through a spiritual transformation. And but if you hold it in space and you love the person and you wait, you're patient, then you trust the universe, and things showed up for her too. And so eventually we ended up where we could talk about these things. Now, the idea of the media taking the story again, and right now there's a possibility of this being turned into a movie.
That's fantastic.
Which I would very much like.
Yeah, okay. As long as it's true to the story and that you have control, over, because it would be horrendous if it was Hollywoodized again.
It's very hard. I discovered it's very hard to maintain control over a movie. It's John Grisham is a neighbor and goes to our church, and he's of course one of the most popular authors. And he said basically there's almost nothing he can do to control it once you sign the contract. So that's a toughie. We're struggling with that right now.
Yes, yeah. Well, I wish you luck with that, because I hope it's such an important story. It's such a story that I think with the book it can touch and affect people, and likewise with the movie if it's done right. So I do wish you luck with that.
Oh, thank you.
As the book is out and as the book is reaching people and stuff, what are your goals? What do you want to do? You want to get Brian's story out. What else do you hope to achieve?
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought that I knew what my next book wanted to be, and I've really been too busy to get to it. I mean, I still have a teenage son. That's teenagers require lots of time and effort, and I'm very fortunate that my job opened up time for me to write as well as to spend time in helping him. So I have a very full life right now, but I'm getting very hungry to write this next book, and it keeps changing. And now I think I know what it wants to be, and it's much more positive than what I had thought I wanted to write about before. I have to honor a few more people that have to be honored in it, but I think that it would be the next step where I would be hopeful and allow people to learn more of what Brian has been teaching me.
Okay. As we bring the interview to an end, we always ask our guests for any advice that they would give listeners who are maybe in somewhat similar situations, maybe the loss of a child, the loss of somebody close, or maybe somebody who is aware of something, to use that phrase, paranormal or spiritual, but a bit timid about speaking out. How would you encourage listeners to do what you did, or to emulate you in some way? Like, what does it take, just even to stand up and talk about it? I know you said you became very perceptive at knowing who was open to listening and who wasn't. But in general, how would you advise people who want to follow your path?
Okay, well, I was lucky. I mean, I had, it was like playing tennis with the world's greatest tennis player. My game just, I could trust them. And so it was the same with Brian. After he died, I could trust him. And I could just allow this trust to let things happen. The big problem with life and with grief that stops the process is isolation and helplessness. And so I was very fortunate that I had a community around me, and that Brian continued to help me, and all of these things showed up. So if I had to say one thing, it would be even the worst thing that could possibly happen can be a way home, can be a path for transformation.
I like that. The worst thing that can possibly happen can be a way home. Yeah, okay.
And that if you will allow, and that's the big thing in our physical, materialistic world, is that we tend to keep it much smaller than it needs to be, so that we have control over it. But if you will accept help, it will be there. And if you will, instead of being helpless, if you will take whatever shows up and use that to help yourself. I mean, even if it's just, I'm going to take another breath. When you're in the midst of the greatest loss, sometimes that's all you do, is just go from breath to breath. But if you do that the breath will bring something to you. You just accept it, learn from it. It will take you somewhere else. This is an infinite game that we're playing, and people keep trying to tell you that it's a finite, limited world that you're in, and that is not true. Mathematically, it's not true. It's not true scientifically. And all of this stuff, if you are willing to let go of your limitations, even just a tiny little bit, and the greatest loss will be a pathway to something else. I don't know what, but I just do know that you can trust it.
Oh, wow. Again, it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing journey. It's not even a story, it's a journey that you're on, a journey that Brian set you upon and really did change your life. Beyond Reason is the name of the book. The website is beyondreason.info, but people can get that. They can get it on Amazon, they can get it anywhere. They can go to the website, obviously, for more information. And I think, is there excerpts or a first chapter or something on the website as well, so people can...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also what I discovered was that when I share the story, people chime in these other stories, but they kept them secret because they did not feel like it was acceptable to share their stories. And when you do, you start getting this community. Oh, yes, I heard that same thing happened to me. So I created a forum there that people could share their stories.
Yeah, I saw that actually. I went in last week and I did see that part of it. So yeah, you're open to people sharing and for people sharing their experiences back and forward. Greg Corbin, MD, a pleasure just to listen to you. I could listen for another hour. I really could. And I do wish you luck with the next book, which, as you say, is taking shape. And I wish you luck, as I said, with the movie adaptation of all this. And I wish to luck with regard to it being done right, because as we're well aware, and as many guests on our show have said in the past, the mainstream does put its own spin on things, leave out the power sometimes of some stories, and this is a perfect example. So hopefully you get a better treatment in the movies than you did on radio back in the day when that happened. And again, wishing you success, and I would hope that we could touch base again at some stage in the future. It'd be good to get you back and see. Because your journey is this journey that Brian set you on, it's never ending. You're always learning and discovering, and that comes out in the book so much that every experience seems to set your mind spinning in another direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure, and you're right. This story goes and goes. And that's the one thing about it. There's really no limit to where it can lead. And I'd be delighted to talk with you again sometime.
Okay, I wish you well. And we had great fun organising this interview between clocks changing in my part of the world and clocks changing in your part of the world. But eventually we got it done.
We got there,
and that's a bit like life, I suppose, as well. You just never give up, and you were a gentleman through all of the misunderstandings. And again, take care, and best of luck with your work.
Okay, you too.
And that was Greg Corbin, MD. The website is beyondreason.info. Check that out. You can see some excerpts. There's a forum, various pieces of info there. Beyond Reason, name of the book as well, Greg Corbin, MD. Well worth reading. My copy has been shared around to a couple of friends. We've each... it's interesting, we each take different things from it, but worth checking out, definitely. Beyond Reason. Archive of all our shows, depending on where you are listening to this. irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com for the archive, and we're on iTunes, and of course we're on facebook.com/Irish Side of the Moon. Please take a moment to check out our Facebook page. It's an active community, a couple of stories there. Man detained after GP wrote letter without ever seeing him, posted there. Again, story of a man whose family in Ireland concerned about him, and he was committed without a doctor actually examining him, simply based on the testimony of his family. Quote, the reason why he wants his case to be highlighted in such detail is to show how easily a person can be involuntarily detained and all their rights taken away, and when they are, the treatment very often is a cocktail of powerful drugs and very little in the way of psychological intervention. Mary sent us that story, and it's on our Facebook page. A couple of other ones there. Drew Wilson offers a perspective on what SOPA, S-O-P-A, means as a citizen of a country outside the United States. Underneath that, Planet Kepler 22b offers hope of life so far yet so near. Interesting discovery there. A planet that just fits all the appropriate criteria for life, similar to our very own. Beneath that, Eurozone crisis poses military risk, warns Defence Chief General Sir David Richards. And again, interesting story. What do you think of that? Do you agree? Is it nonsense? Whatever. Again, check out our Facebook for the link to that. Here is a 28-year-old whose startup is moving 350 million and wants to completely kill credit cards. Tiny 12-person startup churning out of Des Moines, Iowa. Dwolla was founded by a 28-year-old. It's an innovative online payment system that sidesteps credit cards. This gentleman, Ben, has no financial background, yet his operation is moving between 30 and 50 million a month, and it's on track to move that 350 million mentioned in the headline. Unlike PayPal, Dwolla does not take a percentage of the transaction. It only asks for 25 cents, whether it's moving $1 or $1,000. Very interesting story there, worth checking it out. And the last one, the real history of corporate personhood. A link to a story, Meet the Man to Blame for Corporations Having More Rights Than You. And it's a long piece, 7 pages. Worth reading if this information is new to you, and indeed it was new to me. This was not one. This is Shane found these links. And that brings us to the end of yet another Irish Side of the Moon. If you are downloading this, then the show is at an end, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. I hope you found this useful. Please share the link around online if you have found it worthwhile. If you're listening on a radio station of any sort, be it bricks and mortar or online, please stay with us after this music, because we will dive into the archive to take us to the top of the hour. In any case, you're very welcome back for the next Irish Side of the Moon. That will be show number 87. Bye bye.
We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
This is just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.